German Korean project research. So we try to present.
Well, try, I don't know, but for me, the startup one,
I've got to admit that
artistic activity and to facilitate critical reflection, both bilaterally, that is Germany, Korea, or multilaterally, other European countries, or even between. Finally, a project that we did with so that's our contribution as part of the organisation to Franco-German Korean project.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm really happy to see you all here to this session called The Inner Security. And I was just telling the other speakers that actually I have the impression this year that the audience is very open to everything and just a great audience to have around. And I wanted to start with that impression because we're trying to create a new setting here, and I would like to invite you, if you want, to sit as close as you want and join in with this different setting of our conversation. I tried to create something like a living room atmosphere. I hope you have at least the idea of what it should look like, and I tried actually to get some carpets, like old psychoanalyst carpets that they have to create that cozy atmosphere, because I had the feeling that first it's really important to speak about this dimension of security that is the inner security and a very personal dimension of security. And it's also something that is not the easiest part, so maybe we need a different approach and a different atmosphere to start doing that in a public space. And when we speak about security, we often speak about national security and very global dimensions of security, and we rarely in public speak about how these measures of security are embodied by people, by individuals, are collectively embodied in our societies. And we're forgetting about the individual very often. And sometimes I have the feeling that even though a lot of security politics have a deep effect on people, they're somehow left alone with that. It's a personal problem. It's seen as a personal disability or personal problem issue that someone has to solve on his own as an individual, a kind of weakness. But in general, all these problems in a social dimension add up to be something very broad in a society. I think Sarah Diamond mentioned in her talk a few days ago that at the age of 32 in America, 50% of the population qualifies for an anxiety disorder. And I think these numbers are just shocking. And also there is talk about this age of anxiety, but still we're talking about it as an individual problem and not as a collective problem that we have to talk about as a society. So this is what we want to do today. We want to get to this more individual dimension of security politics and want to ask how it affects our decisions in our lives, our relationships, and our ability to trust, and also our mental health. And what I mean by us is, of course, a broader perspective, but also I mean us in this room, so feel very much invited to share your own ideas and questions and remarks about this. There will be half an hour after the presentations to do that, and I would invite you to do it if you want to. Firstly, I would like to introduce the speakers that we will listen to in the next 1 hour. Stefan Schumacher will be speaking first. He's the director of the Security Research Institute in Magdeburg, and he just told us that he started out as a hacker, pretty much, and then decided to go to university again and studied psychology, besides other things. And Stefan brings in also a lot of practical experience because he works as a consultant in companies to train people in security. So he has a very practical approach also to that topic, and we will hear about that in a little bit. Our second speaker is Professor Martin Hartmann. He's a philosopher at the University of Lucerne. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. And his focus is generally political philosophy, but particularly the topic of trust. And Martin will share with us some thoughts on trust in the digital world, and especially on trust under the condition of surveillance. And our last speaker and presenter is Sophie Hoyle. Sophie is an artist who will share with us a piece of art that pioneers at the Transmediale, I think. It's especially made for today. It also is called Anxious to Secure, like the whole stream. And I think her work addresses the relation between anxiety disorders and technology against the backdrop of a narrative of a crisis and a state of exception that we've been also been talking about through the last days very much. And to my mind, her work is a very elaborate dive into the overall topic of this stream, Anxious to Secure. And yeah, I hope you will enjoy that as well. And yeah, we will now start out by listening to the presentation that Stefan has brought to us. And yeah, please enjoy.
Yeah, thanks. First, I would like to thank you for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to talk here. As already said, my name is Stefan Schumacher. I'm from Magdeburg, which is just 2 hours south of Berlin. And actually, I started out as a computer hacker, or not really, I did not really start as a hacker, but I started computing at a very early age. Fortunately, I had the opportunity to have access to this beautiful Roboton Kleincomputer KC85, which was one of the small computers produced in East Germany. We had 1.4 or 1.7 megahertz, and we had to store our data on cassette drives. You can see it on the right of the picture. Fortunately, I had a real computer science teacher, so we did not do just writing letters or playing computer games, but we really did computer science in school, and that gave me the opportunity to get an introduction into how computer things work. And ever since then, I'm interested in how computing works, how security works. I got sucked into the huge topic of cryptography, and I really love doing work there. And I'm also interested in how people work. And since I have been working as a consultant, I have to do trainings in companies or with people. I started up projects to teach students how to encrypt their mail, how to use PGP or GNU-PG, or other things. I've been involved in several open source projects doing security hacking stuff there. And I got sucked into this huge field of human behavior, and human behavior is discussed in psychology. That's why I went back to university and studied educational science and psychology in Magdeburg, and finished it with a thesis on the psychological dimensions of security. And I often have to deal or have to do with technical people, with hackers, system administrators, people coming from a very technical point of view, being trained as computer scientists or engineers, and they often have a quite different idea of how human people work or how human behavior is controlled. And therefore I like to ask them some questions in the beginning of my talks, and those questions are: who thinks they can wash their hands? Hand up. Who thinks you can wash your hands? Very good hand washer. Yeah, who thinks they can disinfect their hands? You know, we had this EHEC crisis 2 or 3 years ago in Germany where people died of pathogenic agents, and I found it quite interesting because I'm also a member of a health club and fitness club in Germany, in my hometown, and they offer those disinfect sprays to disinfect all the stuff you have there. And often people go there, grab the disinfect spray, spray the machines and wipe it off. And they completely ignore that they have to wait at least 30 seconds. So all those people are doing is they create resilient tribes of bacteria, pathogenic agents and other stuff. I'm not a microbiologist, but they are doing bad things with a good intention. They want to clean the stuff, but indeed they are giving us more problems. And that's a huge problem when you think about washing your hands. Many people don't wash their hands long enough. Many people don't know how to wash or disinfect their hand. If you want to look it up on YouTube, you can find a video on how surgeons have to wash their hands. And this takes up to 5 minutes to get their hands clean. And usually people think they know how to do it and they know why they have to clean their hands, but they don't really know how to do it and what happens there. And that's something that also happens in the technological field. I worked as a system administrator for several years, also at our university at the Department of English and Russian Languages. And you can imagine that the old Russian teachers working there did not really have much insight into how computers and IT security worked. So I had some funny incidents there. And that's what got me interested into this field. How do people construct their version of security or IT security? So basically just a very small rundown on what we are doing in our research program is we say that security is concluded by making decisions. Now, if you ever heard of Heinz von Förster, he's our theoretical background. How people make decisions is influenced by their experiences and behavior of individuals. And psychology is the science which researches these topics. The German definition of psychology is that we are researching there how people experience things and how people behave. So I say psychology is required to research security. IT security is, of course, also being researched by computer science, mathematics, electrical engineering, and other stuff, but we also need psychology, which is currently lacking. I also say that psychology is the only science able to research the basic fundamentals of security. It's not mathematics or computer science or electrical engineering, it's psychology, because it's about human behavior, and that's the most important part. Maybe some of you might have heard the name of Ignaz Semmelweis. There is also an old movie about him. He is called in German Retter der Mütter, the savior of the mothers. He was a physician from actually Budapest, and he moved to Vienna to become a physician at the General Hospital there. And during that time in the 1850s and 1860s, a lot of women died giving birth in the hospital. The hospital was for free, the populace of Vienna could go there for free, and they could also go to a monastery where nuns were working as midwives. And the interesting thing is that more pregnant women died at the General Hospital, where physicians, trained physicians, were working. And this spread the rumor, or the rumor was spread on the streets of Vienna, and many women refused to go to the General Hospital because they were afraid of dying there. And Semmelweis did some research, and he discovered that physicians transmit pathogenic agents. Pathogenic agents at that time were not known already. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch did their research 20, 30 years later. So he found out that, or he proposed that physicians should wash their hands while visiting patients. And they refused the idea because there was no explanation why it should work. He laid out a huge statistic. He did a trial at the hospital, and he could reduce the mortality rate dramatically by around 80 to 90%, but yet the established physicians in Vienna considered his idea somewhat crazy. They rejected his idea, and they forcefully sent him to psychiatry in Vienna. And he was driven out of Vienna, and he went back to Budapest, where he died later as a poor and bitter physician. This effect can be explained by psychology. What happened there? Why did the other physicians did not accept his proposal? Why did they reject to wash their hands? This is human behavior, and this can only be discussed and explained by psychology. Another example, some of you might remember, the first flight of Ariane 5, the French space rocket in 1996. They phased out the Ariane 4 and started the first Ariane 5, flight 501, in, I think, April 1996. Unfortunately, the rocket was destroyed after 32 seconds. What happened? There was a huge report written on the technical failures, and the report found out that the developers of Ariane 5 took the control and monitoring software from Ariane 4. There were some limitations and some problems within the software, which was well documented by the developers of Ariane 4. They wrote a huge manual, a project manual, and they described what they did and how there are limitations within the software. But unfortunately, the developers of Ariane 5 ignored all these limitations. They were written down in the project documents. And unfortunately, these limitations hit the computer, and the computer thought the Ariane 5 is getting out of control, and therefore the computer self-destructed the rocket. Another interesting thing is that the French government pressured the scientists to put on payload onto the rockets. They wanted to send out satellites, and they had 3 or 4 satellites in the payload bay. So not only the rocket was destroyed, but also 4 satellites which were payload, resulting in a damage of around 320 million euro. Now, this is also something that's not a technical problem, it's a psychological problem, or a problem of people working in groups of risk behavior, risk aversion and other things. And that again is a topic of psychological research. We have other problems in computer science, problems I often that often occur in IT security, or I encounter those in the wild. Users choose weak passwords. It's a huge problem that users choose strong passwords and don't put it on a yellow post-it note onto their TFT or other displays or to their keyboard. Users are not interested in IT security. They don't consider IT security to be relevant, yeah. They don't consider it to be relevant. They usually think that they are hindered or that the system administrator set these things up to annoy them. It is an annoyance to them. They don't understand how security works. They often think, my computer isn't a target, I'm not the chief executive, therefore I don't have interesting stuff, but if you hack one computer of a company network, you can easily access all the other important computers. We have a problem called buffer overflow. For those who program, they know it's easily avoided. Buffer overflow it's a technical problem. It's done by programmers not checking several things, and they have been around in the wild at least for 20-25 years, and they can easily be avoided. Unfortunately, they still occur, even in secure software. For example, OpenBSD had a remote buffer overflow, and they pride themselves in being the most secure operating system. We have other stuff like system administrators forget to update their software, using MD5 still as password hashes. Social engineering is another huge topic. People calling users on the phone claiming that they're system administrators or consultants or someone else, and they need important pieces of information, and people give out their passwords because the guy on the telephone sounds so convincing. And of course, this is a problem of security awareness, where we have to use psychology and didactics and other stuff to train our users. One interesting fact known in psychology is the so-called phenomenon of risk homeostasis, which means that risk behavior, how people behave in different risks, if they are risk accepting or not, is controlled by different variables. In psychology, we use variables as a model to model how people behave. And this phenomenon includes the self-perception, your subjective skills, how you see your own skills, the objective skills, how your skills really are. There is a huge gap usually. People think they know something about IT security, yet they don't know much about it. The perception of risk, and of course your risk acceptance. This is currently researched as a field or subfield of industrial psychology because it is important, for example, for air traffic controllers or pilots. You want that your air traffic controller and pilots are really trained in how to behave in risks. But this also is important for workers, nuclear power plants, motor vehicle operators and other people. There was interesting research done in Dresden shortly after the war came down. The East German taxi drivers switched from the Russian-built Volgas, which were basically Opel on the stand of, it was an Opel factory brought to Russia with technology from the 1930s. So the Volga was really a very basic car. It was used as a taxi in East Germany, and when the taxi drivers switched to Mercedes cars, they had more accidents, though the Mercedes had better technology. The question was why? And the thing is, the taxi drivers got more security measurements in their cars, and therefore they took more risk, because they thought, well, the car is going to save me. But unfortunately, you can only go so fast when driving in a curve until you get blown out of that. And that's another interesting thing that happens when people have to behave in risk, in a risky situation. And that's what we are going to do to research in our research field, or research program. So that's my basic introduction. In case you're interested in contact me, here's my contact data. And otherwise, I'm done with my introduction, and therefore, thanks. Yeah.
We can come back to questions after all the presentations. Okay, maybe you want. I give my microphone to Mark.
Yes, thanks for the invitation. I have to admit that I'm not really an expert in technology questions. I use technology, probably naively, but I don't know a lot about it. So I'm also glad to be here because I might learn something. So I'm a philosopher, as Theresa said, and I discussed the question of trust. I should admit that when discussing trust, largely in political philosophy, I came across security questions, but not really the kind of security questions that we're discussing here. This is probably because in general, when you talk about trust, when you think about trust, when you define trust as a philosopher, it's not security what you aim at when you trust someone. In contrast, you may refrain from wanting to have security in a relation, say, or in knowing a certain outcome. So in that sense, trust and the whole question of security seem to be sort of opposite to each other. But that may be just a surface impression, and maybe a little later I might talk about a deeper sense in which trust and security are related. My general question for this event was, and that's of course the general question that is usually put to you as a philosopher when you deal with these questions, does all the surveillance that we are confronted by destroy trust? And if asked like this, of course, my brilliant answer is, what trust do you mean? Trust is a large topic, it's a very general term, it seems to be everywhere nowadays, so it's not really helpful to put the question like that. So let me just introduce some distinctions. In political philosophy, as I said, we usually talk about trust in government. I mean, that's what you know, when you have all these public survey questions, you know, it's usually a question: do you trust your government or do you trust the politicians? And you know that the answers are quite negative nowadays. The trust rate is very low. So that's a topic that is quite common in political philosophy: trust in government. Actually, it is an important topic, and of course the whole surveillance discussion has to deal with this, because part of the reason why trust seems to be destroyed may be that the governments, or at least many governments, have implemented surveillance technologies that leave us somewhat without power and maybe without the ability to trust. So it is an interesting and important question. I give you just one example. This is a historical example. John Locke, he was one of the first political philosophers who introduced, actually he basically introduced the whole notion of trust into political philosophy. He said, well, if you give people, politicians, a power, you entrust power to them. So he conceptualized the whole relationship between the people and the politicians, say, as a trusting relationship. The interesting thing about it is, that sounds so banal. I mean, what's the point of calling it a trusting relationship? Well, in Locke, which is important to mention, that means you can withdraw trust. If you think that the government abuses the trust or the power that you gave to them, you can withdraw. You can say, I no longer trust you. So that was an important democratic move, if you want, or liberal move in political philosophy. So there is something of importance here in calling the relationship between the governed and the government one of trust. It's not harmless. There is always the possibility to withdraw trust if you think that the agent that you entrusted power with abuses it. I stress that because I will come back to this at the end of my short presentation. And the important thing for Locke is also who judges whether trust is abused or not. Well, it's the people, it's the governed. They are the ones, and you see they retain power. They are the ones to say, we think that you abuse the power that we handed over to you, and therefore we want to take it away from you, or have re-elections, whatever. I mean, there are several things that might happen then, or make a revolution for that matter. This is something that Locke actually discusses, being himself an author living in an era of revolutions. So that is how trust in a simplified form is conceptualized in political philosophy. Another kind of trust, I said I want to distinguish certain models of trust, is trust among citizens. This is also something that you find often in surveys. The World Values Survey, just to give you one example, every year asks people in all nations, do you think that other people in general are trustworthy or not? That's the question. So you can figure out what you might want to answer. Do you think that people are trustworthy or not? In general, yeah, not your friend, not your girlfriend, not your mother, father, no, people in general. And the results, if you follow these surveys over the years, are quite depressing. In most countries, fewer people trust others. Particularly in the United States, the numbers are dramatic, and the decrease in trust is dramatic, but also in other countries, even in Switzerland, which is where I teach. Switzerland is, you know, small, cozy democracy in a certain sense, but even in Switzerland, well, I know you have second opinions on that. Even in Switzerland, where public trust used to be quite high, it is lower. Interestingly, the institution that gets most trust in Switzerland is the fire brigades. That's interesting, isn't it? So in Switzerland, people trust the fire brigades, not so much their politicians, and not so much the general, you know, other people, the citizens, co-citizens. Now, the whole surveillance question, of course, has put this trust under pressure. I mean, terror, the whole idea of terror is, of course, to make people, in a very deep sense, insecure about pretty much every other. I mean, this is, I'm not a psychologist, but I think part of what terror does is it robs us of, let's say, a deep sense of feeling secure about others. Everybody might be a terrorist. That's the idea of terrorism, that you no longer know who might be the one or who might be the dangerous one or not. All of this seems to have an influence on people's willingness, and that's the point that is of course important for us, to accept security measures or surveillance measures. If it is true that others seem to be less trustworthy compared to whatever time in the past, if that's true, and if there are certain factors that influence our general attitude towards others, such as the fear of terror, that may be a link, you know, the decrease in trust and the fear of the other. And a link to the wide acceptance, which is sometimes surprising, but you mentioned it in some parts of your discussion as well, the wide acceptance of, let's say, a blatant security measures, you know, like CCTV cameras and all of that, which are around, I mean, everywhere. Maybe even here, I don't know. And people know it, some are worried, but it is surprising how many are not worried. And maybe this is because of this, the several links that I've tried to describe just a minute ago. Now, that's another distinction, trust among people. It seems to be changing. And maybe, and that is an exploratory question, I'm not sure about this, maybe people are more willing nowadays to link their willingness to trust others to an acceptance of certain security or surveillance technologies or measures, which is, as I said at the beginning, maybe contrary to what we might think trust really is. Because, as I said, and in philosophy this is certainly the case, when we think about trust, we try to leave people alone. There is a nice sort of definition of trust from a philosopher called Annette Beyer. She says, being trusted, or trust means being trusted on one's own, being left unsupervised. Being left unsupervised. So you see, that might be an idea you have of trust. But what we might be noticing right now is a change in our concept of trust. It seems to be the case that people if they want to trust or if they are willing to trust, do so only on the basis of, let's say, the acceptance of security measures that suggest to them that others cannot really threaten them, or that there's more security given the technologies. So by saying that, I already mentioned the third distinction that I would like to just briefly talk about, the trust in ourselves. So we have trust in government, trust among citizens, and trust in ourselves, or trust in myself. Usually when we think about trust, we can more or less judge whether someone is trustworthy or not. We all do it, every now and then, because we have to. When we certainly in the electronic realm, where we confront people we don't know, we sometimes have to wonder: is this person trustworthy or not? How can I find out? Can I find out? So it is a question, and if we think it's not trustworthy person, then we refrain from interacting with her, and if we think she might be trustworthy, we interact. So it is an everyday question. It's not really an expert question, the question of trust. Usually we can judge pretty much whether someone is trustworthy or not. Again, terror, there are not a lot of studies in philosophy, certainly, concerning philosophical interpretations of terror, I should say, as far as I noticed. Terror destroys this kind of basic trust, you might call it, because in a certain sense, as I already indicated, what it robs you of is the judgmental competency that you implement on an everyday basis in judging other people. You might just not know who the one is to threaten you. I guess on a certain level, the mass surveillance that we discuss may be a reaction to this very, very broad endangerment that we seem to be confronted with. I'm not saying this is not justifying these measures. It's just maybe explaining why all these secret services think they have to survey everybody, basically, because everybody, after all, might be dangerous. I mean, given certain threats. Maybe that is the idea behind it. Of course, my take on it is that we should not accept this. And now I come back to my beginning, the political aspect, or even the Lockean aspect that I mentioned. Being left unsupervised, I said this is an interesting sort of mini definition of what trust might mean. This means, of course, refraining from supervising or surveying someone. It's an active act. It's not because you cannot supervise someone, it's because you don't want to. And that may be what we might call, still sensibly call, trust. You might follow someone if you want to, but you don't do it because you think it's wrong, or because you think it destroys the autonomy of the other, or because you don't think that the project that you follow together can be fulfilled if you survey or observe the person. So it's a moral notion, as it were, trust. If you trust someone, you don't want to survey the person, even if you could. So that's what being left unsupervised means. Now, obviously, when we have mass surveillance, in the sense that we discuss, this does not take place. There is a distrust from the government, from the secret service agencies, in us as citizens. Otherwise, we probably couldn't explain the massiveness of the attack on our privacy and on our autonomy as citizens. And in the Lockean model, certainly, if the one you entrust with power distrusts your judgmental competency as to who to trust or who not to trust, that is an abuse of power in a certain sense. So in that sense, we shouldn't accept it. The danger, I think, that we face, and I guess this is something that a normatively oriented political philosopher would say, is the danger, maybe not the danger of being dominated through all these technology or surveillance measures, but potentially being dominated. We don't know what happens with these data. We don't know whether they are used or not, whether they're even observed or not. We just know they're stored somewhere, and people might, if they think fit, try to get hold of this information and then even go further and influence us. And in that sense, of course, just knowing this, our attitudes towards others or towards the politicians who implement these measures or who accept them changes dramatically, probably. Now, the question that I have is, so that in that sense we lose freedom. And I haven't talked about the encroachments of privacy that's another topic that we might want to talk about when we talk about trust and surveillance or security technologies. But just given the idea that freedom means non-domination, we are in that sense not non-dominated, we are dominated because even if we are not actively observed, we have to fear that potentially we could always be observed or our data could always be used even against us. And that in a certain sense is, I think, the political problem. In the Lockean terms that I introduced at the very beginning, Locke is a liberal, and I'm not really, you know, my political, how shall I say, values are somewhat in a different area, but in that respect he is interesting because, as I mentioned, you can withdraw trust, and should we do this today, given all these measurements and technologies that seem to rob us of certain important civic freedoms, I guess in a certain sense, yes, because as I said, if the ones that we entrust with power, and we still do so through elections or whatever other measures, abuse this trust, we should rescind trust and try to find better people. I'm not sure if these better people are around, but that's, of course, complicated, complex questions. So the real problem, from my point of view as a political philosopher concerning the question of trust and security is the question of what you nowadays sometimes call post-democracy. I mean, this is a large topic in political philosophy. Are we still in democracy or in post-democracies? And some people have suggested to us that we are living in post-democracies. And in the sense that I introduced at the beginning, this may be the case because we don't seem to influence the parameters that define the levels of security that we want granted from governments or from secret agencies or not. We may accept that they have to take care of our security to some extent. I guess most of us would be ready to do so. But who decides this? It doesn't seem to be us. It seems to be somewhere in the back offices where these decisions are made, and that's not democratic. So in that sense, there is a lot to say for rescinding the trust that we or the power that we entrust certain people with, if the problematic is as I described. So do I have a minute or I don't know? There might be. Just a last thing that interests me. I said at a certain point in my talk, maybe people accept that the willingness to trust is linked to accepting security, higher security or surveillance measures. As I said, I don't know if this is true, but of course you mentioned this as well. Subjective security feelings and objective security facts diverge. I mean. People are afraid of areas which are not really dangerous. This is a big problem, I guess, in the psychology of security, that people are crazy about the security of certain areas which are basically secure. Now, who are we? Now, let's say we introduce cameras into this area, or policemen, or whatever other measures of surveillance. I mean, let's say people then decide, oh, okay, we can go out on the streets again, we can go to these areas again. Maybe we can trust again to go out on the street if there is police, if there is cameras, and so on. Should we say this has nothing to do with trust? Because as I suggested, trust is something completely different. I wonder if people's people's attitude towards trust is changing in this security direction. Originally, to my mind, trust and security sort of are opposite, maybe not fundamentally opposite. If I trust someone with something, I don't want to be killed, I don't want to be robbed, I don't want to be lied to, and so on. So I want some guarantees, but on a deeper level, as I suggested, I refrain from observing or from following the person. Maybe that is changing. I just wonder, this is an open question I have. Are we willing to redefine our idea of trust and link it much closer than used to be the case with the notion of security feelings? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah. You can also see that as a question to you. I'm interested in what you think about this. And now I will hand over to Sophie Hoyle.
Thank you. I'm going to give a very brief introduction before I screen a short video essay made for this panel discussion. I'm an artist whose current work explores anxiety, threat, and security from embodied experiences of psychiatric conditions, including anxiety and trauma, to wider geopolitical scales, discourses, and structures of permanent crisis. The initial interest in these topics comes from personal experience of living with psychiatric conditions and their treatment in the UK, relating to my family from and living in the Middle East, and how they're perceived as a security threat by UK police and the UK Border Agency, and how the Middle East is constructed in Western news media and international relations as perpetually unstable or in crisis in order to justify an interventionist foreign policy and security strategies. According to a study by Baxter, Scott, Voss and Whiteford, on average, 7.3% of the world population suffers from anxiety disorders. They were found in every society globally, varying from 5% in African cultures to 10% in Anglo-European cultures to 8% in the Middle East and 6% in Asia. Symptoms of anxiety are classed as a psychiatric disorder when it impacts an individual's ability to participate in everyday activities within socially constructed norms, or causes them disproportionate suffering. A medical diagnosis looks at the intersection of biology, personality, and life circumstances in order to make a diagnosis, where a person's life experiences are often quantified and abstracted, medicalized and objectified. Many psychiatric conditions are considered an invisible illness or less visible when the person is not having an acute episode of psychosis or mania or other recognized forms of abnormal behavior. This video essay was made to be a starting point for discussion rather than an end in itself, and it just gives a very broad overview of the interconnections between these topics. So if you could play.
Thank you very much. This is my, yeah, now it's on. I was just saying thank you very much for bringing this video essay to this round today. And I would like to invite the audience, yeah, maybe we can put up the light. If you have questions, please hold up your hands and people will come to you. I will ask questions and you can think about something you want to say. And when there's a moment, we will always bring in questions from the audience. So please raise your hands and people will come to you and I will try to see you as fast as I can. So after this, which I think is totally a conversation starter, you bring in so many dimensions around the anxieties to secure. And also about what Martin was saying, I have a feeling we're talking about a situation of a broad shift where we witness that more and more people are losing trust in the government. There's also, yeah, the threat of terror where we start losing trust in other citizens and more anxiety disorders, at least on a statistic level, that are evident. Also, I think that maybe each and one of us has the experience that more and more people are struggling with burnout and symptoms going towards that direction. So I feel that there is a general shift that we're witnessing today. And I'm wondering, like, how is this shift happening? Also because you mentioned, I think in your video essay is very evident that there is a distrust regarding the healthcare system and the pharmaceutical system. And you mentioned that maybe this is just a normal reaction to the state of insecurity that we're living in. So I wondered if you could start the conversation by saying how you feel these both shifts working together. On one side, the pharmaceutical company, which is maybe not more helping, or yeah, is it helping more, or is it actually trying to prevent people from being cured and dealing with this?
At least, yeah, in Western Europe, the sort of discourse of mental health is just very easily recuperated by capital and all these mental health apps and self-help books, and sort of it's turned into the wellness industry. So I think, but yeah, so I'm not sure if that's what you meant.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned all the amounts of medication that are given to people, and that the rates of people having some conditions that are treated now in this way are rising. And I wonder, like, is this a question of interpretation of these reactions, or are we actually witnessing like a shift towards expressing more of these problems in the backdrop of the security politics that we're witnessing?
I mean, I think there's probably a greater rate of diagnosis, or more people are aware of these issues and they're kind of going to see specialists about it as well, which might affect the increasing numbers. But I think just being under neoliberalism, a sort of austerity era, this sort of insecurity, the lack of job security, the kind of sense of no future for younger generations, that kind of definitely contributes.
Is there anything, someone over there, maybe, yeah. You can also like put up your hands while we're speaking so we can already get to you, and then we're faster to include you in the conversation, so there is another person there. Okay, let's start with the question from the person.
Okay, thank you. I would love to question maybe develop a little bit the question of trust. As Martin was talking about, because you were doing like the topology of trust, and the trust to the system and trust to the others, but I'm also interested in the trust in ourselves. I always remember this joke that when two engineers talk to each other, you know, after graduation, and one engineer tells the other, like, you know, when I realize what kind of a engineer I am, I'm really afraid to go to the doctor. And it's like it's supposed to be funny, but never mind. You probably have to be an engineer to appreciate the joke. But it's about, like, we maybe even stop trusting ourselves. maybe it's not the problem of rising anxiety of the mistrusted governments, but maybe it's a problem of too much self-awareness. Like maybe I want to be surveilled because I don't trust myself. Maybe I'm a terrorist, you know. Maybe when I cannot fill the CAPTCHA 5 times in a row, then I realize maybe I'm a robot. So I wanted to question if you may think that lack of trust can be a problem of ourselves. You know, maybe we like this condition. Was that sensible?
I don't know, but I'll make the best of that. Well, I mean, I mentioned this trust in ourselves, and as far as I understand you, it seems to be sensible to say that people no longer have trust in themselves in the sense of being able to, first of all, to judge for themselves where untrustworthiness lives, as it were. By being told, and as you've shown in your film, continuously being told that there's insecurity all around. I mean, all around, not just here or there, but everywhere. How could you ever be able to find out where exactly? If it's everywhere, it's nowhere, or you just can't apply your own individual power to judge who is trustworthy or not, which is, if it's intact, an important capacity we have and we need, as I tried to say. But in generalizing insecurity, in telling us, oh, we need to implement all these surveillance technologies because danger looms everywhere, we lose this capacity, or we no longer know where to apply it, as it were. You might be dangerous, I might be dangerous, and so on. So in that sense, I can no longer trust my own judgments concerning who's trustworthy or not, including, and that's probably what you said, as far as I understood, including maybe the capacity to judge whether I myself am trustworthy or not. That was your point, right? Yeah. Maybe, you know, I mean, Max Frisch, I think, Swiss author, comes to my mind. He at one point said, it's amazing how few people commit mass murder. You know, it's amazing given, you know, bourgeois society. And then he deals with people like that in some of his plays. And this is, of course, just, you know, sort of a provocative thought, you know, because in general, I hope most of us don't find it that difficult. But in the end, you know, if everyone tells you that there's danger everywhere, maybe it is everywhere. You don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we should discuss this maybe. So that's the problem. We no longer know how to apply the notion of judgmental competence concerning trustworthiness of others and of ourselves. And that is a massive point, because after all, our willingness to accept all these security technologies or all these medical, pharmaceutical, capitalized ways of seemingly securing health or stability or security, this willingness to accept all of that may have something to do with the lost self-confidence in a certain sense that has been driven into us through all these also economic measures, neoliberal measures, while at the same time, and that's the paradox that you mentioned in your film in a certain sense, at the same time being told that we are responsible for our decisions. So neoliberalism is paradox in many, many respects, but that's certainly one of the biggest paradoxes, telling us if you fail, it's your mistake, while at the same time, of course, it's quite clear that it's not us who fail, but there's systematic levels of failure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, before we take in the next question, which we already saw over there, I think I would like to come back to the dimension of technology, because I think that you each touched in a certain way how technology plays into anxiety and into a new, maybe a new definition of trust. And I would like to start, maybe broaden up this discussion. You can all answer to that if you want, but I would like to start by asking, is there really a place for trust in IT technology? Because it seems that you're saying we're now not trusting the person anymore, we need to trust an intermediary and a somehow technical agent. So is there really a place for trust in technology, or are we speaking about something else maybe?
Scientific answer, it depends on how you define trust. So there is a lot of discussion about trust going on in IT security, hacking and other parts of technology, because whenever you're using a computer, you have to trust that computer. Just giving an example, whenever you use an ATM to withdraw money from your account, you have to trust that this computer is giving you the right amount of money and is not stealing the data from your EC or MasterCard or whatever you're using. So you have to trust this computer. You also have to trust that your ATM trusts the banking computer that gives out your account data. So there's a lot of trust involved. But it's mostly done in a mathematical way. So computer scientists, especially those who do networking and communications between computers, use the term to describe if they have secured the communication between two computers by using cryptography, digital signatures or other measurements like secured network cables and such. So there is a discussion about trust, but in a completely different way. And I've tried to bring in other forms of trust. For example, many computer scientists think that they can make sure that that a system is secure if they just analyze it deep enough. But the more or the further you go, the more complicated it gets. And once you reach the level of mathematics or theory, you have to trust in mathematics. And since Kurt Gödel has shown that mathematics might have some mistakes, you also have to trust these outcomes. So there is a lot of trust going on in IT security. It's used in different ways, and I think the discussion has to be made also in computer science if psychological forms of trust or sociological forms of trust have to be included in security analysis.
Right, so first of all, let me say thanks for a fascinating panel so far, great presentations. I do, however, feel slightly lost, and I think this might be due to the fact that we are talking about a lot of things. We're talking about psychology, we're talking about technologies, we're talking about trust as a basic condition or enabler for societies to work in the first place. But we haven't really talked about what security is. So this might be the missing link here. So just a question for all of the panels, for all of the speakers. Could you say what security is for you, to give a definition from your perspective?
I think that's a beautiful question. I don't know how many people of you were at the super school opening. That was a question that came out that had no answer. Like the whole room had no answer for that, even though everybody was included. I think it's a very interesting question, and good that you bring it up. Does anyone want to start to answer to that? I definitely made up my mind about it since I'm the chair for Anxious to Secure, but I would like to give the word to you first if you want.
Yeah, I can start. Actually, I wrote my bachelor thesis, 90 pages about what is security. So I had a lot of opportunities to discuss it. The thing is, there are several forms or ways to define security. In computer science, we usually use things like, oh God, how are they called in English? Integrity of data, authenticity of data and such things. I criticize this a bit because it's only the technological point of view on it. We keep out the human behavior and the human perception out of this analysis. I also dug into other fields, how they describe and discuss security. For example, electrical engineering has a complete different view on electrical security because they have different problems. They talk about, is the enclosure of an electrical device built in a way that no one can touch electrical contacts or something like that. And they don't have users that tinker with the device. So if you open an electrical device, you lose your warranty or you void your warranty, and you actually are not allowed to use it anymore. So they don't have to live or have to make devices secure in a way where people tinker with it. Unlike in computer science, where everyone can install apps or programs on a computer system, and you have to keep that in mind. And my personal definition of security in my bachelor thesis was that security is a social construct, which means it's made up by the perception of everyone, and it's also influenced how society defines security. There is the famous story of death by fan in South Korea. I don't know if anyone ever heard of it. It's a phenomenon or a meme in the internet. In South Korea, after the Korean War, the government wanted the population to save electricity, so they made up the story that you die if you keep your fan going on through the night, because you die of cold. The fan will blow the air around and people will die. And therefore all the South Koreans turn off their fans, and that turns now into technology, because all fans in South Korea have a timer to turn it off during the night, because people are afraid to die of a fan going on through the night. And that's how it influences, and how society also influences our perception of security. And I think there was a great scene in Lord of War, the movie, about where a gun dealer moves to Mogadishu or Somalia and wants to sell guns, and the people in Somalia are watching a TV report about crime in the US, and they say, oh, the US is so insecure, would never go there. But they were living in Somalia, which was a war-torn country in that time, and their perception of security was completely different for the US. And that's how everyone makes up his own version of security.
Okay, that's a very broad answer. Everyone makes up their own version of security. I was thinking about this a lot, so I made up my mind a little bit. Does anyone jump in? No, or am I doing this first? Is that okay? And I read a lot of things about security. I found something very beautiful. Security studies, pretty much the consensus on what they can agree on for security is it has to do with threats. And that's pretty much how far they get. And personally, and I will speak about this tomorrow more, so that's why I'm not gonna roll out my full length of thoughts here, but I think there's at least 3 notions of security. And the first one would be the notion of security as a question of survival. It's really us as beings wanting to be secure to survive in this world. And then there is a dimension of security, which is the dimension of political security, where we are, as you said, having something like the social contract theory has this idea that we rely on our states to provide security for us, and it's a trade-off that we're making with the state. So that's at least the thing in theory. And the third dimension, I think, is security as a technological concern, or in a technological sense. And I'm not sure if that is right, but I very much have the impression that in a technological sense, security is a question of worst case scenarios. So you assume anyone could be an attacker. And sometimes I have the impression that this changes a lot about how we construct security system, because it's not anymore only a political dimension. Anyone with this system could be seen as an attacker. So yeah, that's just some thoughts. I hope that answers a little bit. Okay, we have other questions over there.
Yeah, thank you. I've entered the room a bit late, so I can just make a comment on the impression of the film. But anyways, I think it's a very important topic that that has to be addressed here. That this pull towards security from education to state, everything, those helicopter parents and everything. And one thing I'm thinking about, what's the other option? Because I think when we are going for surveillance, trust is already lost, and transparency in some sense is the substitution for trust. It's another technique of holding the things together. And at the same time, we have untrustworthy people in society. I think that's clear. And David Foster Wallace, I think, wrote in an essay in 2006 that, called the victims of terrorist attacks, in some sense, martyrs of freedom. And I want to ask you if this might be, for society, the idea that we have to accept terrorist attacks, shrug it off as say, okay, we want to protect our freedom, which is in a very tenuous relation with security. You know, you cannot have both. We live in a very secure state or in a state of freedom. But do you think that this could be a solution that I think which is definitely any party trying to go for something like this, they will fail utterly, I think, in the politic territory.
Sorry, what was the quote, the David Foster Wallace quote?
The quote was that the victims of terrorist attacks are martyrs, like martyrs of freedom, like the opposite, not martyrs of religion in some sense, but martyrs of freedom, because they sacrifice themselves. That you get the idea?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this sort of trust in the greater good, or subsuming sort of, the individual to the greater good. I think there's a lot of sorry, I'm trying to kind of assumption that the sort of that security and all these I think like Martin was saying, that the assumption that it will kind of do something or come to actually affect the risk, but the increase of security doesn't really affect the original danger. And I'm not sure if...
Is there another question, or otherwise? Oh, there's a lot. Okay, maybe we go over to that corner.
Hello. It's not so much a question; it's more of a passing comment, really. I suffer from a personality disorder, anxiety disorder myself, so you might have to bear with me a little bit. About 15 years ago, after a traumatic experience in my childhood, I suffered severe panic attacks for many years. For years, I was fed different pills, try this, try that, just pill after pill after pill. They didn't work. As soon as I refused to take those pills anymore, all of my treatment was stopped. I wasn't entitled to treatment. I wasn't entitled to financial aid. I was very agoraphobic at the time. I was forced back into work, which obviously made things considerably worse. I was very lucky to have a very good system around me that helped me through it, but I now see my sister, who's got a personality disorder, through post-traumatic stress, going through exactly the same thing. And I just wonder, how are we ever meant to make a step towards dealing with this when it's not only our government we're losing trust in, but now our doctors and those that are there with a responsibility of care towards us?
I don't know if we have any answer to that.
Just a passing comment.
Does anyone want to respond? We can also just take that as a comment, which I think is also very valuable.
Well, my comment and my question is partially also in response to this, I think, because I think it's quite worrying, the emergence of ideas of embedding trust within technology, with smart contracts, for example. And in my own experience, I've been interested in just really beginning to think about some of the processes of self-organised and peer-led support that was touched on a little bit in Sophie's presentation. And just two examples, which I've only come across recently and tried once, as LARPing. This was actually an art world LARP that was written by Lizzie Stark, and we had a combination of artists there, but we also had LARPers who are outside the art world. And then another one is a work by an artist called Leah Clements, that's a group of empaths. So she's designed a test to find out if participants are empathetic, and if you're empathetic, you can come to this group and choose particular topics to discuss how we might cope with particular experiences. And both of these are forms of closed group meetings and might be considered safe spaces, and there's lots of conversations around how we define a safe space and how we implement that, and a move towards privacy rather than, and then what does that mean for civic society. And just in terms of Sophie's suggestions, going back to that, the suggestions at the end of her presentation, I made a note of them as self-care, peer group, and tactical withdrawal. And it'd be interesting to just expand on these a little bit, to think about to what extent self-care might be part of the problem in terms of self-surveillance, and to what extent peer support might be the answer, or is tactical withdrawal still a possibility, and to maybe think about very practical examples of those processes.
So the self-care wasn't meant to be in the sense of self-surveillance, but in the sense of not being physically and mentally exhausted, so that you have the capacity to act politically, that it's not just a narcissistic self-care, that it's self-care in order to then act politically or to act with your peer group. Or the idea even of these safe spaces is to create a space and then come outside of the safe spaces to kind of move beyond them. Is that what you meant in your question?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of questions in the room. I would like to ask one, and then we only go to all the questions in the room that are left and that we can handle. But there's something that interests me a lot. In case we're losing what we used to call trust, and I think this is something that Ethan Zuckerman proposed, that there's a shift towards communities starting to use distrust as a powerful tool, and as a tool that now constructs mechanisms of controlling the ones in power, controlling governments. But I'm wondering, like, what do you think we're losing if we're building a new society on distrust instead of building a society on trust relationships?
Well, in the original model that I was talking about, there is of course distrust already is already part of it, because you have to control the government, whether it's doing what it's supposed to do or not. So I didn't mention it, but it is already integral to the model. So in that sense, trust and distrust go together. But still, of course, you might say, certainly if power is involved, and if a certain entity has a lot of power, as modern governments to some extent still do, you should be very, very careful about handing over this power and about trusting this agency. So it is always, I guess, the extent to which distrust has to be part of trust sort of hangs together with the amount of power that you grant someone. You probably never should grant total power to anybody, certainly not in a free society. So, but apart from that, say on an everyday level, of course, you might still say we lose something if we exchange distrust for trust. I mean, I guess we lose quite a lot. I mean, distrust can be stressful on a very simple level. You have to take care, you have to observe, you have to control. You can't just let things go, and that is one thing you lose. You lose, let's say, on a very existential level, an easiness of living, of letting people alone or letting them do whatever they want to do. So that's one thing you lose. And of course, in a certain sense, the person that you distrust loses also something, namely a certain amount of autonomy or being left unsupervised. And in our societies, most of us hopefully still want to be left unsupervised in many respects, maybe not in all, but in many. And of course, if we distrust these persons, we lose something. Call it freedom, call it autonomy, whatever you want, being left alone in a certain, very, very strong sense. So these are two things that come to mind, what we lose when we replace distrust for trust. But again, in certain other respects, when it comes to questions of power, I certainly think that we shouldn't think of distrust and trust as total opposites. I mean, both are engaged attitudes. If we're interested in something, we might at the same time accept that we trust a person and every now and then check on that trust. I don't think that destroys trust, but that depends on the model of trust that you use, of course. My model of trust is not a naive trust. So.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but if there is one last short question, I think we can do that, and then we will finish this session.
Okay, thanks. So my question is on the topic of job security and economic security. And I've noticed, me being an artist in this Berlin world, that the market's really saturated, and I think that there's a lack of trust between the employee and the employer, and sort of like a disconnect between what we used to have in a sort of like a mentor and apprentice relationship. I guess my question is there really hope for rehabilitating this sort of relationship to gain more trust within a employee-employer relationship?
I'm not sure if I understood everything you said acoustically. You think that in the employee-employer relationship there's a lot of distrust right now?
Yeah, just because of the market's being super saturated with professionals, you know, everyone leaving university and coming out with these skills, and of course they're looking for people with experience or specific skill sets, and there's also the loss of inner security whenever you as a person applying for these positions, like several rejectance rates or, you know.
Yeah, okay. But, well, I'm not sure if this is a question of trust. I mean, the situation that you're describing certainly is true. But at the same time, the whole story of the role of trust in employee-employer relationships is more complex, because part of what you call neoliberalism is, of course, to say that, I mean, what Eva Illouz has described, you know, the role of emotions in capitalism, or what people in the sociology of work describe as subjectivization of the work sphere. Emotions seem to play an important role in the work sphere. They seem to be, in fact, they seem to be worked with by companies. Companies like Google or Apple want not just your, you know, work capacities as such, they want your emotional capacities as well. And part of that might even be trust. So there is, surprisingly enough, a large literature in the management literature on trust. It's not that this is inimical to it. Let's not talk about trust because we want power, 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 and that's it. So, but if that is so, if that's a true description of the state, things really get complicated, as you can tell, because then trust all of a sudden becomes a dirty category, because it's used by, let's say, by employers to seemingly get rid of some power. I entrust you with this or that project in project capitalism. That sounds great. At the same time, of course, this raises stress, because you are left alone to some extent, and who's responsible if you fail? It's yourself. And then if emotional energies are involved, this may cause new stress levels. You may just not want them to be involved at all, because you just want to work and go home and be happy. No, I mean, you can't, because, you know, you are more deeply involved as an employer, as an employee. So I'm just trying to say in a nutshell that it's not as simple as saying that there's only distrust in the work sphere. There is a large discourse on trust in the work sphere, and it's complicated because it's so vicious in a certain sense. That's, of course, all, you know, important categories have this black and white character. On the one hand, we think it's good if we can trust people, and if our employer trusts us, but at the same time, it's complicated, because it puts us under certain forms of stress, and maybe sometimes it might be better if the boss takes care of things or accepts responsibility for certain decisions and doesn't load off all the important decisions on his employees.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to the speakers. And yeah, we've finished the session now. So thank you for coming.